Hello, everyone, and welcome to the IHRM webinar series. This webinar is part of the series which began in 2020 during the COVID period. And now we are already at edition number 39, so it will be our anniversary in January. So it's been a pleasure to see this series grow, and we are especially happy that many of you have become regular attendees, which is really a pleasure. So the recorded webinars are available on our YouTube channel, and we hope they continue to be a useful resource, especially for those who can't travel or can't always attend international conferences. The series is co-organized by Mila Lazarova, Simon Fraser University, who is also one of today's speakers, Elaine Farndale from Penn State University, Miguel Olivas from Clarion University of Pennsylvania, and Marion Festing and myself, Maral Muratbekova, from ECP Business School. And we have a great technical support from Kara Adrian from Penn State University as well. So today's webinar is titled Beyond One Size Fits All, Contextualizing Gender Diversity Management in Global Organization. So the topic is timely and a very important one. And we have four well-known speakers. And I will keep introductions brief. I can't, give you the whole bio of all of them because it will be very long. So Lina Knappert is professor and head of the Institute for Diversity and Gender in Organizations at WU Vienna University of Economics and Business in Austria. Eddie Yang is Smith Professor in Equity and Inclusion in Business at Smith School of Business, Queen's University in Canada. Kati Bader is Professor of International HRM and Head of the People, Work and Employment Group at the University of York in UK. And finally, our co-organizer, Mila Lazarova, Professor of International Business at the Beatty School of Business, Simon Fraser University, Vancouver, Canada. So we are delighted to have you all here, and let's begin the session. And maybe Kati, we'll start with you first. Could you explain the background of the special issue that you organized and published in the HRM?
Fantastic. Thanks, Maral. Thanks so much for having us. I think we're all very delighted to speak about the special issue. So thank you for that question. I think that's very nice to have kind of this starting point to go back where we started when we the first ideas that we had about the special issues, and it goes a bit further back to a project that I've done where we looked into multinational companies' kind of responses to gender inequalities and differences in gender equalities in Japan and in Germany. And back then, to our surprise, we realized there's not much literature out there. So we thought there must be a lot on how to manage those gender inequalities because we've been speaking about them for quite a long time. But this literature wasn't there. But also we realized it was quite difficult to publish that paper because on the one hand, we had the IB or international business, international management community that wasn't very open at that point towards this topic of gender and the question, why do we need to look into gender equity and gender equality specifically? And on the other hand, it was the kind of EDI or DEI literature where this kind of contextual differences between the countries wasn't really looked for. So we really kind of struggled to get that paper published. And we realized there is some kind of bridge missing between the gender and gender equality literature and the international business, international management literature. And that's where we started having these conversations about the special issue. So with Lena and Ed and Mila, where we started to think about how can we create a bridge between these different disciplines. So you might know that Lena and Ed are more kind of their research is much around the EDI or DEI literature and these topics, whereas Mila and my research is based in the international human resource management literature and research. So we thought this would be a fantastic opportunity to try to provide this bridge. And so we put in the proposal for the special issue into a human resource management journal, and we were very delighted and pleased when we got this accepted. And I think it's basically more timely than ever because interestingly, and that's what you see on the slide, we all know these kind of gender gaps still exist. And when we started this in 2020, and I remember Mila used this quote in one of the initial kind of presentations we did around it, because it was the height of COVID as well. And when we spoke about this webinar series that started at the same time, but we also know that gender equality was kind of threatened during that time because much of the house and care work was put back on women. So the UN Secretary General said limited gains in gender equality and women's rights made over the decades are in danger of being rolled back due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we thought this would be really a good kind of timing for the research, because we do know the problems, but we didn't know much about the solutions. And interestingly, now a few years later, we can see that the problem still exists. So that's why these kind of solutions that we hope to provide with this special issue are more timely than ever. Here in 2024, gender parity inches slowly forward. The pace of travel is such, however, that full parity remains beyond the reach of another 5 generations. So a lot of work needs to be done. And that's, as I said, the idea of the questions of this special issue. We wanted to, first of all, understand what do we actually know? Because, as I said, there wasn't much out there initially. And we wanted to know also from kind of related fields, from the EDI literature, but also from the transfer of practices literature. So what do we know about the management of gender equity and equality? Because we know about those differences. There are a lot of indices that tell us like gender equality is still not at its, or hasn't achieved everything yet. Also, we know none of the countries in the world has closed the gender gap fully. So we really want to understand what is the scientific evidence, but we also want to push this agenda forward and look into what effective gender diversity management practices would be. So research on multinational companies, but also local companies, to find out what the effective practices are. And also because we know differences in institutions are particularly strong when we talk about gender equality. We were also interested in this question, whether and how multinational companies should or could adapt their practices to local kind of institutions. And this webinar is now kind of bringing us full circle, because that's now the way of sharing the findings and the learnings that we had during the process.
Great, thank you, Kathy. So Mila, then the question is to you. What do we know about the practice transfer?
Thank you, Merle, and thank you, Kathy. As Kathy said, the reason that I was brought on this wonderful team is mostly because of my expertise in international HRM. So sitting and looking at this issue more from the perspective of a kind of like an IB meets HR scholar of the entire team, I have the least expertise on EDI, and I learned a lot through this entire process. So if you look at it narrowly from the perspective of an IB person, transfer of practices. We've studied this for ages. Companies do try to transfer practices, and they frequently find this much harder than anticipated because there's all these barriers that they see along the way. And in a sense, seen at a very high level, there's not much new that's here. I was chatting with Kathy earlier, and Kathy said, "Oh, please don't say that. It doesn't mean that there has nothing new." And of course, it doesn't mean that this literature has nothing new, just from the perspective of this, kind of looking at it from a interdisciplinary perspective. What is unique about this literature is the context. It is often studied in the realm of transfer practices. EDI practices are studied frequently. And you will notice I say EDI practices, despite the fact there's a really fantastic review that came out in JIBS a couple of years ago that looked at diversity in IB. And they found out that of all the sort of attributes, gender was the most studied one. So having said that, in IB, a lot of the literature that's out there does not uniquely speak of gender. There are a few studies that focus on gender management diversity in MNEs, but oftentimes gender is just part of the mix, part of the diversity mix. So that was kind of one of our first findings. It is in a way, though, an extreme example, because when it comes to gender, things are very different institutionally, things are very different culturally. It touches on a lot of sensibilities. It's around norms that are contested in many places. Things around people have a lot of debates. So it does provide a very unique context for studying practices. So this is what makes it very exciting. So it is a sort of the classic dilemma of a multinational, the push and the pull, trying to be locally responsive while at the same time trying to do something for the entire organization. So historically, in the transfer practice literature and in GDM as well, there has been more of a tread cautiously, stay local, because things are just way too different and you won't be able to do very much. But over the years, you kind of see this shift that within emerging global agendas of multinationals, more and more of them are trying to think of gender and think of gender management, not just at the headquarters of the organization, but around the organization. So there are a few studies. Most of them are qualitative. Most of them rely on institutional theory, both in terms of sort of classic institutionalism, if you wish, and new institutionalism. So conversations around legitimacy are very big in that literature. Sometimes on both ends, whether something would be considered legitimate in the country or not. So overall, and again, from perspective of IB, perhaps not surprising, but the studies, like each study is unique in addressing unique contexts, and kind of like the idea is that you need to have context sensitivity dial up to a 10, because again, you may have legal restrictions around this. Even in places when you don't have legal restrictions, you may face resistance from local entities. There are studies of organizations that have gone very strong and have found that they need to sort of like dial back on their gender management initiatives and organizations. There has been some interesting new literature around the fact that good things can come from subsidiaries. Traditionally, the assumption has been that we kind of have a more progressive country that is trying to do something in a less progressive, and I use that term with caution from terms of gender equality. But there are now some examples of reverse transfer, where you would have a subsidiary in a more gender equality country, in a higher gender equality country, and they will do things that will then be transferred back to the subsidiary. And that reflects what's happening in the broader field of IB as well. There is a lot of discussion around the fact that subsidiaries are not just passive. They have agency, personal agendas of people, both trying to transfer practices and trying to adopt or block practices comes into place. So a lot of discussion around power. In the broader literature, there's been an interesting study, which was again on broader diversity initiatives, but the idea that you can translate a practice, not just adapt it as directed by headquarters. There's some really interesting literature which came out at about the time that we started the special issue, and that idea that advice from multinationals to localize, whereas traditionally seen as wise, can be contested. So sometimes not being like the locals is a good thing, could be beneficial for the organization. Sometimes if you localize too much, that can have implications for your broader organization. This is not something that we did in the special issue, but all of us remember the IKEA example of where they removed all women from catalogs in Saudi Arabia, and there was backlash against them in the Western world. And that idea that sometimes you can have a lot of advancement on gender and diversity management in organizations by introducing things that are not specific about gender. So there's this fantastic study by Song that talked about IKEA introducing practices around who is a full-time worker and who is a part-time worker that led to more women in Japan becoming workers. And the end of the story is they get recognized as an employer of choice and start working with the ministry to introduce new laws in the entire country of Japan. So there's a lot that's happening there. I can speak a lot more, but I think I should probably stop now.
Thank you, Mila. So the context sensitivity is very, very important. So Lina, what would be your take on how national context would shape how gender diversity management is implemented?
Thank you so much, Maral. Thank you for having us. Good timing. for being interrupted. So what we found, of course, in our own review that also led us to actually starting this special issue was that we see generally, as also Mila already mentioned, we don't see so much comparative or context-specific research that is really focused on gender diversity. So there is quite some body of literature already that deals with these questions, but more on the general level of diversity management. And then gender is sort of considered a part of it. So what we find important and what we also see in the literature is the differentiation between comparative studies that look at the general form and shape that gender diversity management practices might take. And that is to be differentiated from the differences in the implementation of practices. That, of course, we also see differences across countries. And then, yet again, differences in effectiveness of gender diversity management outcomes. And so all these three steps are worthwhile to be looked at and to be analyzed. And we also see studies, of course, that are focusing on these three different areas, sometimes also in combination. For instance, there is, I think, one of the first studies on diversity in general, diversity practices across countries that looked at the form of diversity management as well as the effectiveness by Hila Perez and colleagues. I think it was from 2015. So those studies were really shaping the field also in the way how we think about these differentiations today. And sorry, pressed the wrong button. Trying to navigate the slides. And so generally, not surprising, of course, gender diversity management needs to be considered as something that is not a one-size-fits-all phenomenon, because we do see, of course, differences across cultures, across regulations, different laws, and also cognitive institutions. So the level to which there's knowledge about gender, what is gender, how gender is understood as a concept, and how gender management or diversity management is understood in organizations. And of course, all these influence the practices, the implementation, and also the effectiveness with regards to the outcomes of those management practices. So that we, sorry, so that we see that often gender diversity management practices travel as best practices. So there's evidence and also anecdotal evidence that indeed there are best practices that are being transferred, but then still organizations, and what we also just heard from Mila, need to adapt them to local laws and local norms, so that there is really this need for cross-country, contextualized, comparative research that we can really understand the contextual adaptation. But then again, there isn't so much out there, and still not, which is maybe also understandable in light of how complicated this kind of research is. As those of us who have tried it in the past or who are dealing with those kind of research designs probably know this is a really difficult research to really manage across countries.
Okay, thank you, Lina. And Ed, could you talk about the role of the top management teams in headquarters or subsidiaries or both in this implementation and adaptation process?
Hi, Mara. Thank you for that question. So, when you talk about top management team, the thing that comes to mind right away, of course, is Don Hembrick's upper echelon theory, right? So, in this respect, I'm more of a DI scholar. So, if you look at things from theories from public admin, we talk about representative bureaucracy. So, you certainly see that sort of that phenomenon flow through in IB literature as well. So, the gender of top management team members certainly has an impact in terms of the gender diversity management policies or practices that are implemented across MNEs, right? The big question is you keep hearing Mila as well as Lina talk about, the local context. So the question is, how much of the transfer in policies actually flow through from the head office down to the subsidiaries. Now, I happen to have the rare opportunity to work with Hussein Al-Hedji, who's from Saudi Arabia. So he looked at how British firms that won awards for promoting and supporting women and advancing them into top management team, suddenly find some of this success and efficacy curtailed when they're operating in Saudi Arabia, right? So it does really tell us that the host country context really do matter a lot. So a lot of research has been dedicated towards understanding, what are some of the impediments? Why is it that some of the award-winning firms with amazing gender diversity policies actually fail to see it being implemented in the host country itself? Now, with that said, uh, the host country context matters significantly. Later on, I'll kind of share some stories with you as well. But the question here, of course, is what happens if subsidiaries do end up promoting women into top management teams? Now, this is critical because we know, having representation matters, and of course, you build a pipeline there. But oftentimes, when subsidiaries of top management teams actually build or promote women into top management teams, it's really a lot of tokenism, right? They haven't been able to effectively sort of spread the practice across the subsidiary organization itself. Now, I also want to share that there are some rare cases where the host country subsidiaries actually have stronger institutional support for gender equity, more so than the parent company itself. So think about Japanese multinationals operating in the US, right? So in the US, as a host country, the institutional sort of strength for supporting women tend to be stronger. In this case, it actually helps the parent country national or the multinational actually develop or enhance their profile, gain greater legitimacy by virtue of adopting some of the host country policies. This is also true with the case of mergers and acquisitions, right? The spillover effect from the host country back to the home country is significant. Definitely, it bodes well with respect to sort of the reverse flow of management transfers that Mila had alluded to earlier.
Okay, thank you, Ed. And you actually already started a bit on what would be the practical recommendations actually for M&E. So Mila, can you develop more a bit on it?
Yes, after I unmute myself. Thank you, Maral. So you may be confused a little bit by this slide. Generative AI helped me generate it. What I was trying to convey with that is that multinationals in a multinational setting, they're stuck in this place between being shrinking violets and doing nothing, because the focus, as Ed was saying, is often on the challenges of implementation. And being a bull in a china shop when they're like, no, we shall do this no matter what the local consequences are. And neither of those approaches is really very effective. Yes, there are many challenges. Yes, sometimes you have tokenism. At the same time, there's plenty of examples of progress. There can be progress. There is progress if organizations handle that sensitively. So not so much as the bull, but also not to use the local constraints as an excuse to do nothing. So as Lena was saying, as we all have been saying, that is, we're circling back to the same message. Recognizing local sensitivity is key. And to loop back to what Lena was saying, that's partly why this research is so difficult, because when you read these papers, people spend months and months and months talking to various people across the organizations, recognizing their various standpoints, because even within the same organization, you would have people with very different thoughts on the issue in a particular context, whether friendly or unfriendly to gender diversity management. And this is why it takes so much effort, very much needed effort, because this has given us some really, really rich papers. So these points here is sort of takeaways from the papers that have looked at this. So yes, recognize sensitivities, but don't let that be a constraining jacket and be like, I'm sorry, can't do much about women. It's just a really tough environment. That is not how we expect organizations to behave. Engaging various local stakeholders. Sometimes your allies can be outside the organization, sometimes they can be inside the organization. Understanding, investing the time and understanding the local power dynamics, giving sort of getting this bottoms up approach and co-creating something that's contextually appropriate, which of course loops us back into the think globally, act locally. But it's very critical to actually enact all of these things in the case of gender diversity management.
Thank you, Mila. And Ed, as you have a lot of interesting examples, can you complement a bit on it?
A lot of the examples that I do share do come from the DI landscape, right? So the question of contextualization here that you keep hearing is actually one of the critical barriers in terms of why subsidiaries don't do as well. So we often talk about, best practices. The universal one-size-fits-all approach to gender diversity management really effective? The answer is maybe not so easily transferred, right? Because of local customs and the institutional context that we hear about. I love the example that Mila had raised earlier about IKEA in Saudi Arabia, right? How they actually doctored out the woman in the catalog. Now, they have come a long way. So as you know, there are a lot of cases being written about IKEA in Saudi Arabia. So at the moment, they have actually turned around really well. So what they have done is they offer women more specific roles so that, there's adequate visual representation, symbolic representation, right? But also having women in those roles help, set the cultural expectations and they can better implement sort of gender practices, including sort of gender segregated spaces in the store, right? So in that sort of understanding of what the local customs and barriers are, IKEA could actually much more successfully employ women in sort of senior level management and in a very strong male dominated labor market, right? The other part is empowering local leaders. So we know, at least in the North American setting, we need the CEOs to do, to be the champion. They devote resources, substantive, emotional time and resource investment into it. But we also know at the end of the day, it's the mid-level managers that actually have discretion in how they want to implement, diversity practices, right? Same thing in IB. So what you see, of course, is local managers who actually believe in, gender diversity and who value it tend to support, those policies better. They tend to be implemented much more rigorously, right? I want to kind of bring the example of Hindustan Unilever. As you know, Unilever is a multinational, and what they wanted to do was to increase the number of female participation, especially at the senior level. And they have actually done so by empowering the local managers to actually be committed to gender equality. So having those women, having leaders who champion women's, sort of the entire human resource process from recruitment to development and training, and providing policies like flexible work arrangements are really, really important. I'm going to quickly run through two more because I think they're really important to mention. You also have to monitor the effectiveness of those policies that you put in place. Now, we can all say a lot of things in terms of, companies that are always listed on the best 100 employers for women. Those are just policies. There is no actual monitoring in terms of how well they are implemented. So a lot of countries actually have quotas as well, right? I'll come back to that point later. But I want to use the example of SAP, the global software company. They publish an annual report, but they're not the only one. But when you have year-over-year comparison of statistics and gender representation, especially progression, it speaks a lot. It's transparency and accountability, right? Lastly, I mentioned this earlier, avoid tokenism. So oftentimes when we, I'm some of my colleagues at the Smith School are actually looking at NASDAQ firms. They don't actually have mandates, but rather NASDAQ require, as in legal mandates, but NASDAQ does require a representation of women on board. What they have done is a lot of NASDAQ firms hire just one woman. And that checks the box, right? That is not effective. So at the end of the day, you want to avoid tokenism. That's really critical. What's important, of course, is giving them discretion and power to make decisions. So when you have women who are decision makers, they are much more likely to be able to exert influence, right? People do see them in a much more visible way. So those are the four things that I would say are really, really important for us to consider.
Thank you, Ed. This is really interesting. So now, as we are all scholars, and if we are back to research, Kathy, what do you think are important avenues for research, actually, that we still need to address?
Thanks. Yeah, I think that was also one of the key kind of questions we asked as we approached the end of the special issue, and also when we had the submissions, and we had like fantastic learnings from those submissions. But we were then also wondering, about all the things we don't know yet, because there's a lot that we don't know yet. And I wanted to start with one kind of topic that I've always been interested in, and it speaks a bit to what Ed said before about management and the role of management and why people do things and what happens if they don't do it. So for me, one of those topics I was interested in, or we were interested in, were the motives. So why do people engage in it? Because we do know not everybody is supporting EDI or gender equality initiatives, which we would of course hope for. And so the question we think still needs to be answered is in two ways. One is how can we better find out how to develop these kind of more positive motives, but also how do they what are the effectiveness of different motives that can be applied in this area? And typically, in the literature, we would cluster them in three types of motives. And I think the first one is probably the one that we are all most familiar with, is the instrumental one. So the idea of a business case. So the thought that we invest in gender equality and then something positive comes out of it. So more innovative thinking, better problem solving, better organizational performance. So the idea of a very simple link, investment in these programs and then positive outcomes. That's why many organizations might do this type of work. The second is the normative or the ethical case. So the idea it's just the right thing to do. So when we talk about women, it's 50% of the population. So we should have them represented. And it's just the right and fair thing to do. And of course, that extends to other types of diversity as well. But in the context of our special issue, we discussed this more around gender. So it's the fair thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It's the just thing to do. And that's the reason why we do these gender equality initiatives. And the last one is you can label it effective or the legacy kind of motive. The idea is often like a CEO or a manager who would say, I want to leave a positive legacy. So there's something positive that I want to give the world. So it's not just the right thing to do, but it's more personal motive. And that I think in research, we've mostly applied the business case. So we know the most about this. Because also as business scholars, we're interested in how much do I have to invest in order to get the best outcomes of it. But we also know it's not been the most effective. And I think what Ed said about tokenism is one of the responses to this idea is we just invest and we put one woman into the board and then everything is fine. But of course, that's not what this diversity and inclusion and the ideas of more gender equality is about. So research has shown that it might be better to kind of develop different motives and to do different arguments in terms of the justice argument, because there was less backlash against that, because then you can just say it's the fair and it's the right thing to do. And it's not just constrained to this idea of a business outcome. But we don't know much about it yet. Also, as I said, we don't really know who develops what kind of motive and how they then translate into better inclusion outcomes, better equality outcomes, in particular in an international context. So we also know when we implement certain practices or policies across contexts, in some contexts, they might work quite well. In others, they might not. So when we think about those different motives, and just as an example, if we think about gender egalitarianism as a value within societies, if we have a society that is very gender equal, where there are no defined gender roles, they might respond very positively to this kind of justice case, whereas they might not respond positively to a business case because it seems to be like this artificial way of framing this. Whereas if you look into a country where gender egalitarianism is very low, it might be a first step to think about those kind of financial arguments. They might be more convincing there, but we don't know yet. Also, there might be some kind of temporal effect in place where you say you need to start certain economic arguments because it's organizations we're speaking to, and over time, we can then move those motives. But we are lacking that kind of research, in particular in these cross-cultural settings, because as Lena also said, it's quite difficult to get this kind of data. But when we think about multinational companies, and I think that's kind of an agenda we can push, because multinational companies are a fantastic setting to study these differences across contexts, because with the same motive in different types of kind of institutional environments, we could see how that relates to, as I said, the effectiveness in and across different contexts.
Thank you, Kati. And as we all have different sensitivities in what we would like to launch as new avenues of research, so Ed, what would be your propositions?
All right, so this frustrates me a lot. I'm not an IB scholar, I'm a DI scholar, right? I love the presentation, the comments that Kathy just made. So, as you know, something I learned in cultural intelligence, which is in the IB domain, motivation is really important, right? Because you need to have the motive in order for you to act. That provides the incentive to act. Now, it's when I say I'm frustrated because within the DEI literature, we all know the work by Aaron Kelly and Frank Dobin, right? Who wrote about, why does diversity training not work? What are some of the issues here, right? So then, of course, they later on did more research and then found the response in terms of, some of the resistance as well as backlash. But, within the realm of IB itself, we actually know very little in terms of what practices actually work and what don't work. So I want to go back to some of the comments that Kathy and Mila had made earlier in terms of the approaches to diversity or implementing gender diversity practices right within MNEs. I mean, we know there are two buckets in general. One is the general approach where you want to sort of create an inclusive environment for everybody. So that's a climate approach. It's very macro and generally people feel they are seen or heard because they are part of the global general policy, but yet it doesn't really move the needle all that much, right? So in practice, the general approach might sound really good on paper, but if you're trying to move the needle, I saw a comment in the Q&A, how do we actually, see any positive movements or, what policies are actually efficacious or have got high efficacy, right? So in that sense, you can do a targeted approach. Targeted approach has certain advantages as well, especially when sort of Mila as well as Lena talk about localization and context specific. You need to figure out what approach works for which context, right? That's where a targeted approach might sometimes be more meaningful. The challenge is this. I heard Mila said earlier, most of the studies that were being done were qualitative in nature. What it really means is that it's telling us, well, number one is context specific. So you have to really go in and sort of unpack, the local customs, the local culture, figure out what works for women within a specific context. But that also doesn't mean you should step away from the broader approach. At the end of the day, we still need to devote more research attention if we are serious about moving the needle. So in this case, more research is definitely needed, sort of along the lines of what Kelly and Dubin had done in terms of finding the right balance. The other one I want to talk about is really DI specific as well. So yesterday I did give a talk to Human Rights and Equity Office. And one of the things that we are experiencing right now is when we talk about, diversity, we often talk about white women, right? But there's more than, diversity is more than just white women. There's the intersectional aspect of it, which we sometimes neglect to sort of address. Especially with the current backlash towards DI that we see in the US, and a lot of multinationals are headquartered in the US itself. There is certainly a pullback. I was really quite busy with Pride in June. We're filling media requests, right? So the Pride Toronto organization reported a lot of withdrawal of sponsorships. And then, with some digging, we did find that a lot of those withdrawal of sponsorships were actually American multinationals operating in Canada, like Google and Home Depot, right? Even Nissan Canada pulled out of sponsoring a Pride Parade, in part because they just invested in the US and they feel like they have to align their corporate policies with the political wind that is going on there. So all those things in concert do explain the importance of figuring out what policies are right for which group and within which context, but more importantly as well is to recognize the intersectionality of women who are moving up into top management teams, and just in general being able to have their talent recognized and deployed advantageously. So that's just my really quick 2 cents. I know we're running short of time, so I better pass the mic back on to my colleagues.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. And actually, this is great to have the diverse team because you have very different angles to approach. So, Lena, what would be your views of this?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I'm picking up on what Ed just also mentioned briefly. There is the current challenge that it's a bit the elephant in the room, the anti-DEI agenda that is sort of spilling over from the US to what it seems the rest of the world, but I might have a bias there. So we see this current backlash and the polarization, the fragmentation that comes with it, or is maybe also part of it. So this is just sort of framing where I see a very urgent need in doing more research. This backlash comes with the zero-sum narrative. In our case, that would mean women win, men lose. And of course, that sort of overshadows what gender diversity management actually means, which is a shared societal benefit, which extends way beyond women, who considers all genders and actually improves equality, well-being, and reduces violence for, well, all people, ideally. And so I just found it important to mention this as sort of framing where we or I see major needs for future research. And so to highlight a few areas where we could really benefit from a closer analysis would be to also include those individuals who do feel disadvantaged by the social change that DEI has brought, and really engage those who feel sidelined to really understand their concerns, their threats, because ultimately we need also their allyship. So to really make this work, and also the inclusion idea means that everybody should be included. Also, that is, of course, sometimes very difficult to really practically implement. So to have more analysis really focusing on people who do feel disadvantaged by the idea of DEI itself would be highly relevant. Integrating critical and feminist perspectives, I think, can really help us to examine how power and context matter in gender diversity management. So what we do see also in the submissions to our special issue is of very often a functionalistic view on this matter. And when we really want to understand more and dive deeper into the questions around power and context, then critical and feminist perspectives can really help us here. Exploring how interventions for different marginalized groups are interacting also links to what Ed mentioned earlier. So if we really have a specific focus on women, for instance, or gender actually also means men and all the other genders. So that's something to consider. Or if we really want to broaden it up and really have a general diversity initiative and a general diversity program. So how do these different groups really find themselves in these programs? And what happens also if there's a competition, which we actually see in practice happening quite often between the different interest groups, or, well, to say there is competition being placed upon those groups because there are limited resources and organizations to really make sure that all these interests are being paid attention to. So we also surely need more studies diving into these questions. Also what Ed mentioned, the point on intersectionality, so I will not say too much about this now, but specifically the aspect that matters for MNEs here, I think, is if we talk about women within MNEs, we can of course look at women in top management in the headquarters, but also I talked about earlier as part of one quite established research stream. But of course, women in MNCs can also be the women in the operating functions in the subsidiaries, which, who might be under very different constraints and working under very different conditions than those women in the top management in the headquarters. So also understanding really that women in MNEs is not, that we have will have very different faces, experiences. And here again, intersectionality, of course, might help a lot to understand that. What was also mentioned briefly, and I also want to mention an example here, the responses by MNEs to the current backlash are highly interesting field. And there, of course, what Ed mentioned, so the withdrawal kind of from the DEI agendas and efforts, but also what happens to MNEs who are, for instance, having headquarters in Europe. And one example here, a Dutch company who probably wouldn't want to have them name mentioned. But when I talk to them how they are now dealing with subsidiaries in the US and the DEI programs there, they said, well, officially we don't do anything anymore, but we just keep on going, of course. We just continue our program also based on our headquarter standards. So, but really so this is just anecdotal, this is just like small conversations, but of course it would be highly interesting to see how this is really done, and find some actual empirical evidence on those responses. And last but not least, I would find it highly relevant to also include more multi-actor perspectives. So also really seeing MNEs as actors in their home and host countries, and also see how they interact and negotiate gender diversity management with other actors, local actors, and also global actors in this field. So those would be my key interests for future research.
Thank you. And actually, the three of you propose so many avenues of research, so it's great. So
There's a lot to be done.
Sorry?
There's a lot to be done.
Yeah. We have 14 minutes left, so maybe we can proceed with the question and answers. So we have a question from Anna, I don't know if I pronounce correctly, Fleismanova, who says, thanks for your talk. You stressed how important it is to understand local sensitivities, involve a wide range of stakeholders, and work together to come up with solutions that work in that context. Instead of just saying it's a tough environment, nothing can be done. So in practice, the question is coming, how can MNEs balance respecting local power dynamics with the need to push for meaningful gender diversity initiatives, especially in places that may be resistant or have a lot of internal conflicts? Can you share some examples? So I don't know who would like to answer.
I mean, I said that, so maybe I'll start with an answer, but it doesn't, my colleagues probably have more examples than I do. I mean, part of the answer is in the question, right? So understanding the local dynamics is very important, right? I mean, no place is a monolith, right? So in any country, there will be some stakeholders that will be pro, some stakeholders that would be against. And the question is right in saying that the environment is complicated, but that's part of the trick, is figuring out the complexity. Another thing, Lena was just sharing this for this unnamed Dutch company. Sometimes a company can do things without necessarily publicizing them in a way to annoy local sensitivities. They could be promoting women without specifically having a women promotion program. They could be providing support groups that are more informal yet still supported by the organization. So that IKEA example that I gave earlier, I guarantee you have no stock in IKEA, but it was really like they changed something around how they classified workers. That was the initiative. And that just made women eligible for certain things that they weren't previously eligible, and more women started to work for the organization, right? So it wasn't a gender diversity management initiative, or something else. So think of the goal. What is that goal trying to accomplish, and how it can be enacted in the local sensitivities? So any of my lovely co-panelists have other thoughts on this?
I can just add a little. So, I mean, no other, nothing contradictory. But I think it's as you said, it's a little bit in the question already, because it is about having those conversations with the subsidiaries. Because when we spoke to subsidiaries, often the headquarter would have assumptions about the cross-country context, which are often not fully reflecting the kind of richness and diversity of the context. So it is really starting from there's no one size fits all, but there must be a policy that says this is kind of what we want to achieve, and now we need to translate this into what happens within the different kind of country contexts and subsidiaries. Because also there might be laws actually that inhibit the transfer of a certain practice. So when we talk about kind of flexi time or when people are going to work, because that might be something that is implemented in terms of gender diversity or gender equality. There might be local laws that then kind of, in terms of pay and in terms of what's allowed for, in terms of working hours and so forth. So it is really about understanding what the context is, and then looking at how you can transfer the practice into that context that you're looking for.
Thank you, Mila and Kari. There is a very practical question, in my opinion, from Prashant Taneja if I pronounce again correctly. What types of data, metrics, or indicators do you find most meaningful when assessing progress towards gender equality in MNEs context? Particularly in the countries where official data are limited, that's true, or existing frameworks don't apply.
I'm happy to take that question. That's a really good question, right? Because at the end of the day, that's that cliche, you can't manage what you can't measure. Now, for most part, some places do not actually have official statistics because they don't collect them, or it is illegal to actually ask those questions, but there's nothing preventing multinationals from collecting data internally, self-reports, in order to sort of manage and improve. But of course, self-report essentially relies on trust, right? There are a few data that are really important. I think in order to measure progress and things that people generally, a lot of multinationals actually put out on their annual report. So I'm going to rhyme off a few. One, of course, is general representation in the internal sort of workforce itself, right? You can compare, subsidiary against head office, but that's not a meaningful comparison. But that's really important to actually have a basis or a fossil record in terms of where you start and where you end up, comparing the subsidiary over time. The second one, of course, is middle level management, technical professional jobs. That's really important because it represents the pipeline, and not everybody wants to go into senior level management, right? So that to me is a really critical indicator in terms of, do we have enough of a pipeline, or do we need to develop, invest so that we actually have a potential pool of talent for senior level management? Of course, the third is, measuring senior level management at the very senior level. The other two things that are critical would be promotion rates, advancement rates, right? Do you have a sticky floor preventing women from being able to advance? We talk about the glass ceiling. That's one thing. But the sticky floor, of course, is, have we actually prepared women in order to take on managerial, technical, professional jobs or senior roles, right? That's critical as well. Then the third is attrition rate. Do women have higher turnover than men in general in the subsidiary? That's not just symptoms that would tell you maybe women are turning over because there is a lack of family-friendly policies, or the work environment is not supportive of women. It's a toxic work environment. So those indicators are sort of like, pretty um, pretty bare bones. You can definitely use those as a baseline. Now, after that, of course, if your goal is to have, greater representation of women in decision-making roles, especially in a subsidiary, what you need to do is have they actually have the KSA's knowledge, skills, and abilities in the human capital in order to actually take on those roles, right? So I know oftentimes in North America, we often look at, hey, does somebody have that global mindset, that international experience? In this case, have we sent women from subsidiary organizations, high potential women, to actually gain head office experience? So those be some of the more secondary level supportive metrics that you might want to have in order to troubleshoot some of the challenges that you actually are facing. That's just more of a DI approach. I'm not sure if it's completely viable, practical. So some of my colleagues here who are IB and international management scholars might be able to also offer their views.
Thank you, Eddie. And actually, during your presentation, you mentioned this backlash happening now. So the question would be, how can MNEs respond to the rising anti-DEI climate and people who feel gender equality threatens meritocracy?
Lena mentioned this. I want to see if Lena wants to respond to that.
Sure. Yeah, it's one of my favorite questions also in the classroom, because it comes every time when we talk about gender diversity, and there's always this question, always at some point the hand goes up and asks, but what about meritocracy? And there's a wonderful paper on meritocracy. It's also a bit older already, I think from 2010, by Castilla and Benar and an ASQ, and they basically come to the conclusion with a row of experiments that meritocracy is a wonderful concept, but it doesn't work with humans because we are biased. So as long as we are biased, the idea that there is this merit, this really brilliant performance and skill and ability that needs to be promoted into the top of organizations, has, of course, its value, especially if we compare it with other paradigms of how we can promote people, I don't know, based on their heritage, based on their families, based on money. So of course, meritocracy in comparison to those ideas has its value. But then if it doesn't work in practical terms, because once we get to really sit and evaluate the merit of people, there's biases coming into our way. We really need to find ways to either tackle the biases or say goodbye to the idea of meritocracy and find other ways to find the people who are able to lead the organizations. So we need to, it's a bit of a balancing act, as many questions in this sphere to find people who are very much able to do the job they're supposed to do, and at the same time also find a way to do it in an equal way or an equitable way.
Oh, that's great. I would like that you share the paper with us as well. It's very interesting. There are practical questions from Ying Chen. How did you manage to have access to MNEs for your research? So maybe it's in terms of how do you access the data?
I can take this because we've done a couple of studies on interesting contexts, like Japan, for instance. I always found, I don't know if others experienced the same, but I found it a bit easier to get contact to the foreign subsidiaries. So when you go to that country, it was much easier for me to get like German companies in the Japanese context. So I worked with the Chamber of Commerce, who was kind of a multiplier of my research. So I had a meeting with them, really very practical now, but I had a meeting with them and I said, would you be interested in that kind of research? I can write you a report. And then they gave me access to a lot of kind of German companies. It's much easier when you're in these contexts to find local companies who would speak to you, in particular when you don't speak the language. So it's really when you set up your research design, being very clear about what can I do, what can I achieve, also what kind of co-authors do I need, because then I partnered with someone who would speak Japanese. They would get access to local companies. So it is really kind of building your database and kind of also strategically finding partners to work with in order to get access. And that was for qualitative research. For quantitative research, there are databases and other kind of data points to use. But for that, the ones we did for the qualitative, it was really kind of building the contacts and then just trying to get your way into the country.
Yeah, thank you, Kati. And another question there, so another practical question from Ying Chen is, what journal outlets would be more open to this type of research? HR, IB, or something else? Because you mentioned also that there are maybe not so many quantitative studies. So what would you advise?
I think in the end, it will depend on the framing of the paper. If it speaks to the kind of transfer literature, and if it finds something novel that we don't know yet, it can go into the IB journals or HR journals. I think if it's the kind of biases and kind of looking into the challenges of the gender equality, it might fit better into an EDI journal. So it really depends on what the kind of theoretical contribution is you want to make with that paper. So I don't think there's a general answer to it. I'm sorry. And
No,
no easy
that's
answer.
true. Everything depends on context, actually.
Yeah, so it always depends on
Yeah.
where the contribution lies. So for the last one we published, we really then looked into the transfer because we had these kind of opposite contexts. We looked into transfer. Mila, I think, mentioned this idea that you have a headquarter that is located in a country with higher gender equality indices, let's call it this way, and they transfer it into a country with lower gender equality indices. And we kind of challenged that assumption, and we showed that it really depends on which direction you go, and the mechanisms are different. We could have also looked into something else within the paper that speaks more to the DEI literature, but as I said, it's a bit of a choice that you have to make.
Thank you, Kati. And actually, unfortunately, we have to finish the session because we are out of time. So a big thank you again, Lina, Ed, Kati, and Mila, for sharing your expertise and perspectives. That was super interesting. And a big thank also to all organizing team and technical support. In January, on the 29th of January, we will have the 40th webinar. So it's again our, as I said, it's our anniversary. Yelena Zikic, sorry, who would speak about career transition paradoxes from migrants to digital nomads. It is a very interesting topic as well. So thank you very much all, and hope to see you in January, and have a nice November and December and Christmas break and holidays. Thank you. Bye.